6:30, and as much as I think actually we probably talk more sense about tying ties and the new methods of cutting your grass, it is time to start the latest of our webinars. So welcome to those of you who are looking in. This is obviously another one in our series of webinars, the first one for a little bit. But this one we think is particularly topical. And we are delighted. We're talking about how to benefit from changes in agricultural support. And we really have what I think is a top team here. So just so I can introduce them to you, Adrian Matthews is from Savills, the property consultancy based in Salisbury. He's a farm business consultant helping farmers with business planning and strategy. Harold Makant is from Natural England, and he's been involved in the delivery of land management schemes since 2001, and he's set up schemes in 9 counties stretching from Devon to Buckinghamshire. He's recently finished as a secondment into DEFRA as a policy advisor to the Secretary of State, and before joining Natural England, he worked as an agronomist. And then finally, we've got Todd Jex. He's an agronomist covering Dorset and Southern Wiltshire. He specialises in regenerative and sustainable agronomy and provides internal and external training and consultancy on soil health. So a range of experts, I think everybody would agree. So I'm going to start off and do this slightly differently. And we're not going to actually ask for presentations or mini presentations from our panelists this time, but this is going to be very much a sort of chat and a question and answer session. For those of you who are watching and you do want to ask questions, please use the chat line. It's not one you put your hand up and ask a question verbally. It is you write the question, you type in the question, and then I will pick it up and ask the questions on your behalf. So I hope that's all okay. We've only got an hour, and I know how these things rush on, and it's obviously important that we cover the subjects that you, the viewers, our members, are interested in asking. So let's start off with Adrian. So the title is How to Benefit from Changes in Agricultural Support. So Adrian, what are the changes?
Thank you, Nigel, and good evening, everybody. Great to be part of this. What are the changes? Well, we're going through what has been described as the biggest change in agricultural support for 50 years. And I think that's a fair comment. We've come out of Europe, obviously, gone through the Brexit. So we are now away from the common agricultural policy. And we're looking at, certainly for the audience here and for ourselves where we work, the England scheme. All the schemes are devolved. So here we're looking at the England scheme and the England domestic scheme. And the way that's changing, when we were within the common agricultural policy, support was based on direct support. In the recent years, that was basic payment scheme, but single farm payment before that, IACS, AAPS, a range of different acronyms and names that we had, but it was based on direct support. So if you had 100 acres of land and you had 100 acres of entitlement, and they were all in hectares, but saying it in acres, then you had a payment based on that land and the entitlements you held, and didn't matter what you did with that land, you had that support, providing it was in this, for our part of the world, the non-severely disadvantaged area, it was the same payment rate, it was a direct payment. We're now moving away from that, and it was heralded a few years ago now by Michael Gove at the Oxford Farming Conference, when he was talking about public money for public goods. So the principle of that, the major part of support is through the ELMS, the England Land Management, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, and looking at payments for actions that are to aid public areas, predominantly environment, soil, air, water, those factors, and paying farmers for activities that are improving those. And that I know Harold and Todd will sort of look at those in sort of more detail on those parts. But the government are committed to maintaining the level of support that we had through the Common Agricultural Policy. So that level of support is guaranteed through the life of the Parliament, which perhaps is only another 18 months, 2 years at most, but that's what they've said. We'll look at the detail in terms of some of the numbers perhaps when we go through this, but the ELMS is not directly replacing basic payment scheme. And there are a number of other grant opportunities and support to, as the government says, to aid farmers to invest in equipment, technology and infrastructure to make their farming more efficient, is how it's been described. So there are a range of different schemes. Trying to remember all the different acronyms. There's the Farming and Equipment Technology Fund, which is part of the Farm Investment Package. Different range of grants that come out at different times on that. Currently, there's a grant available for animal health and welfare, open until I think it's the middle of June, which grants are up to £25,000 for specific items to aid animal health and welfare, straight as it says on that, and pig and poultry, dairy farms eligible for that. And then there are other areas such as the Slurry Infrastructure Grant that's currently available as well. And also, I guess, Nigel, when we're talking about grants, it'd be remiss of me not to say that there is also 32 million available through the Future Farming Resilience Fund, which is to help farmers through the transition period, which is the period that we're in now, i.e. the change from coming away from the basic payment scheme, which has been the £90 an acre payment, down to zero by 2028. That period, 21 to 28, is the transition period. And the Future Farming Resilience Fund offers free advice over the next 2 years to help farmers find a way through the transition period. So that's basically what the changes are. Okay,
I think that's a very good and clear overview. So Harold, perhaps you take matters on. Could you go into some more details on these new payments?
Yes, quite happy to do that. And good evening, everybody. I do have a couple of slides which I will share with you. I know that you said we were slide free, but it just helps to concentrate the mind and to keep us on track, or else if anybody had the pleasure of listening to us before we kicked off, you'll know how well we can sort of ad lib. So I'm going to do a very quick little thing here, which hopefully is showing as we speak. Is that up there, Nigel? Can you see that?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, Harold. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk about the it's called an ELMS update, and there's been a huge amount of speculation, press, chat, conversations, etc. in the press, and I just thought I would bring this quote up from Donald Rumsfeld, who many of you will remember as being a rather interesting character from the early part of the century in America. And we were talking about the known knowns. There are things we know, and that's what I want to concentrate on. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are things that we do not know. And I think when it comes to ELMS, there's a fair amount of in that category. And then we've also got the unknown unknowns. So in that respect, I want to concentrate on the known knowns, the stuff which is out there in the public domain, which has been announced, because I'm not really sure that speculating on some of the inner workings of DEFRA, the RPA, and the minds of the ministers is necessarily going to bring us any further forward. Now, if we can get it to go. Oh, aha. So, as the man working for Natural England, you wouldn't expect me not to talk about enhancing nature on the farm. And this can be done at many different levels. So you can do it at the field level, the farm level, or the landscape level. And the key message really with any of this, for anybody who's doing anything in a scheme, is to make sure that you're doing it well, get the quality and the quantity, the variety and connectivity, fairly basic principles. But given that we have now got very challenging targets with carbon and climate change, we've got very challenging targets with water quality, air quality and biodiversity. These are going to be the mechanisms with which we're going to be able to deliver that. And if we don't deliver it, well, I don't know what's going to happen. we'll get taken to court by ourselves. But this is now baked into policy. We've got the Office of Environmental Protection holding everybody to account and making sure that we know about this. Not to mention a very vociferous and engaged group of charities and interested parties outside of farming. So that's the plug for the nature bit, and that's the end of that. What I will do now is just quickly go through some of the changes that we got in 23 with regard to the scheme. Many of these were announced in early January. I think it's fair to say that they were fairly delayed, but we did have quite a lot of political turmoil through the latter part of last year, with prime ministers coming and going and secretaries of states coming and going, and it all got a bit complex, and much of what DEFRA were trying to do had to be shelved. But they got the stuff out in January, a lot of it to comprehend. And so it's picking out some of the things here which matter and which are there for us. So we had payment rate increases in January for options which were in countryside stewardship. Sadly, nothing applied for the higher level schemes, and we have approximately 7,000 of those still on the books. They've been offered 5-year extensions as a way of just keeping things ticking over. And similarly, people with existing CS agreements were offered mirror agreements, again, running it for 5 years. The issue with both those things is that you can't really make any changes. And as a consequence, as the way that things have moved on and farming has moved on, people want to make changes. And that's the dynamic nature of the business. So you can migrate into new schemes, and there is a process for that, and there's a form to fill in, as you'd expect. But with some of these things, you've got this issue of equivalence. And we haven't really seen how RPA are going to be driving that or implementing it. But really, if you're going to want to move from an existing scheme into a new scheme through this migration technique, then you'll have to make sure that what you're offering is as good, if not better, than what you have in the current one. And you can see there that the higher tier is opened. We're just about to bring the application round to a close on the 28th of April. Mid-tiers was opened up in March, and that runs through to mid-August. So you've got an extra month. And then we've got the wildlife offers, which are kind of expanded and giving a little bit of perhaps a simpler route into schemes than perhaps the other two. Here you've got a couple of some of the new payment rates. Now, some of them, are pretty useful, and also the options tend to be the ones which have the highest environmental gain. So legume herb-rich swards, the GS4s, I think that's proved to be quite popular, and you look at the uptake figures for that, and it is there across the country in good numbers. And then we've got the kind of the development of existing options, winter wild bird food, going up from 640 to 732, so a useful increase there. And options such as those, the arable options, can be used across farms in areas which are perhaps not as productive, and you can square fields up and things like that. So you're hoping to be able to increase the amount of offer for biodiversity without necessarily impacting too much on the productive capacity. And I think that's the challenge. That's where Todd comes in, and that's where Adrian comes in, is being able to tailor those suite of options to the particular farm. Then with the capital works, we have a similar sort of uplift. And here you can see a classic example of a hedge. I think that's, you've got to go down as one of the better hedges that we've seen. I think it got attacked by horses, hence its rather stunted nature. Changes with this one, again, capital rates have increased. I'll show that later. We've extended them for 3 years rather than the 2, which was always a bit of a gallop when you moved into schemes because of the delays in getting schemes organized, etc., etc. And the other thing that they've got now is that you can have more than one capital works plan during the course of your agreement, which actually for some people is very handy because you don't want to overstuff yourself with work, and on the other hand, you don't want to miss out. So we've started to use that as a rolling program of capital works. The financial side of it has been raised. There were caps previously with mid-tier, but they've been taken off. And with higher tier, it was always unlimited. And you've got certain options, such as the water quality ones, will need to be endorsed by catchment sensitive farming. But you can kind of see on the right of the screen some of the increases in rates there. And certainly for hedges, it's been a useful rise. You could argue that the fences and that sort of infrastructure has sort of just keeping a sort of check with the market, but at least it's gone up, and it hasn't stayed the same. Then moving quickly on to the SFI for 23, this is where people are starting to look how we can integrate these things into existing schemes. That's quite complex, and really we haven't quite got that message out from DEFRA and RPA how it's going to work. But they are 3-year schemes, so they're shorter than your mid-tiers, which were 5 years. There's quite a number of the options that you get in SFI are sort of mirrored in from the countryside stewardship. And I say with tweaks, sort of wording's been altered to make them more flexible and potentially more applicable. You get a management fee of up to £1,000 for joining to cover the costs of getting people in to help you and those sorts of things. The stackable, you can have more than one option on the same piece of ground, provided that they're different and not in other schemes. Again, a bit more detail needs to be on that one. Monthly start dates, always a nice thing to have, and as it was in the olden days when we had CS or HLS, monthly start dates, and then we got unified start dates coming in from Europe, which makes it all a bit more fraught. But luckily, we're back into monthly start dates. If you've got an agreement and you want to do more, you become more ambitious. RPA tells us you can amend up the value change, but you can't amend down. So if you're moving into these things, start with what you think is deliverable, and if that works for you, you can always add into it. And then at the end of it, there are 268 different things you could be doing. Admittedly, some of them are not going to cover all of the country, so there's stuff there for the coastal plains, etc. And I'm just going to touch on one new standard, and this hopefully gives Todd a nice entree, is that integrated pest management. Now, that's always been a bit of a tricky one to have in a scheme. What do we do? What do we mean by it? So at long last, the integrated pest management, the IPM standard, has come out, and you can see it's applicable across the sector: arable, horticultural, grassland, and even the organic have got it. And for that, you will need a basis qualified advisor to visit you, to assess what you're doing at the moment, discuss opportunities, and then produce some form of plan. That plan can be complex, and I have seen some very intricate ones, or it can be quite basic, the sort of building on a red tractor type thing. There's no one size fits all. There's no definitive version. But for doing that, you get the princely sum of £989 a year. So that's a little bit extra. And then on the back of that, you've got actions. So you do things. And this one here is essentially AB8. It's an existing CS option. This one is a new one, establishing companion crops. People are doing it already in oilseed rape. They're doing it with some of these more permanent clover crops, and even things such as undersowing a maize crop could be considered to be a companion crop. And then you've got the one which is the use of no insecticides. And here, hopefully, we'll come up with the payment rates coming through now, guys. You can see the top one is existing, but the other two are on a per hectare basis, 55 or 45 pound a hectare. Now, some people might not find that attractive, but I've had a number of conversations with people who said, yeah, I can do that, no insecticide. Yeah, we've not used insecticides on the farm for 5 years. What's the big deal? So it is doable. Then just a little bit here about what might come in the future, because we've got a 24 rollout of standards and things discussed, and this is a little bit of the known unknowns, is precision farming has been talked about a lot in DEFRA, trying to encourage the more progressive farms and the uptake of this new technology, which will hopefully be driving productivity And then you've got the tillage practices, of which there's a lot of press and a lot of noise about that. And possibly Todd will give us a little bit of a entree on that one. And then these are kind of speculative payment rates. So don't quote me on those, but I've seen this stuff in some internal documents that we could be looking at payment rates in and around this sort of price range. Whether or not it gets that far is another matter, because all these things are based on the budget. And if the budget is being blown on various other items, then DEFRA will be feeling less generous with some of the options. And that will be done for me then. Over to you, Todd.
Well, before we get to Todd, I've got a question that's come in, Harold, for you.
Yep.
Are the workings of equivalence sorted out? Because no one has been able to answer this so far, I am told.
Okay, so if you're in a higher tier scheme, then you've got cover from the Natural England staff, from myself. And as a consequence, we will be able to work out, it's not just a numerical version, but it will be an environmental equivalence. So I think that one's covered. But I am a little concerned that there is a list somewhere out there which has been published, which basically says that if you've got these options in your CS, then this is the equivalent option, which you can move into something else. I think that's a very blunt and a unsophisticated way of doing it, because there is a different way of assessing it. And I think there's still a little bit of discussion in the camp as to how some of the finer points will be interpreted, rather than it just being a straight numerical area X equals area Y under option X under option Y. But until we see the inner workings of it, and we've had that opportunity to read how DEFRA and RPA are pushing it forward, I think I'm going to put that into a known unknown.
Well, no doubt our questioner, Dan Stover, might follow up on that if he's got anything else to ask on that particular point. If he doesn't, that's fine, or if he does, we can come back to it. So, Todd, you're an agronomist working directly with farmers. What are you doing differently?
So I'm a bit like Harold. Thanks for that, Harold. Some of his comments have led on quite nicely to I have actually got some slides as well, so I'll try not to take up more time than I'm supposed to with them. Let me just make...
It's almost as though we rehearsed this, isn't it?
Can you see my screen? Has that worked?
Yes.
Good.
I think you're okay, Todd. Good.
Okay, so yeah, thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, my name's Todd. I'm an agronomist in Dorset and Southern Wiltshire primarily, and I also do a bit of soil consultancy and training for people internally and externally within the business I work in. I wanted to start a bit like Harold did with a quote, which I took from a farmer called Tony Reynolds that some of you might be aware of over in East Anglia. He's probably one of the longest no-till farmers in the UK, and he got this from America. And it says, despite all our accomplishments, we owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And I think it's a really prudent point for not just the farming world, but also the world in general, that without looking after our soil, then we are going to be probably in a little bit of bother when it comes to food and our very existence. So without boring people by, and I won't dwell on this too long, the basics of the makeup of soil. So we have our fixed part, the mineral components. So over millennia, the weathered material that now makes up our sand, silt and clay based soils. And then you've got your water, your air and your organic matter component. Of course, the organic matter component at the moment is very topical. It's in there at 5%. In reality, that varies, unfortunately, on arable and regularly cultivated soils to much lower than that. And ideally, we'd like to see it much higher than that. The water and the air parts of the soil vary as well. If we went back to last year's extreme heat wave, we're obviously at plant wilting point in most places. Most people's, even their grass was disappearing, going brown. If we fast forward to November or the 140 mils of rain in March, then we were at the other end of the extreme. I think part of the point of putting this up was that we seem to be in a time now where weather extremes are the new norm. Our sort of temperate, moderate climate, if you like, seems to have deserted us. And we've now seem to live in a time where we'll have blocks of weather of 6 weeks or longer of an extreme. And I think that's what's happening this spring. So in terms of establishment systems, obviously for a long time now, many decades, ploughing or inversion tillage is what we've relied upon for establishing our crops, establishing our grassland, a form of weed control. In more recent decades, things have progressed and moved into minimum till systems, and they vary wildly. I could put a whole presentation together on different minimum till establishment systems, but broadly those that still rely on moving the top layer of soil. And the issue with those is, this is a picture I stole from Groundswell a few years ago, but I really liked it as a visual demonstration of what happens to water when it hits soil in different systems. And you can see it was set up with a collection jar, if you like, at the front of the pits and at the back. And it was measuring what happened to the water after it was poured upon these different blocks of soil from different farming systems. And you can see quite clearly that on the cultivated soil, when the water was poured on top of it, that a great deal of it actually travelled straight off in the form of surface runoff, carrying with it the soil particles, and with that attached nutrients and potentially agrochemicals as well. Very little actually infiltrated its way through the profile, which is a negative. And in the world that Harold's described, in the direction of travel with politicians, this clearly isn't going to be acceptable, with water quality being so high up the agenda. In comparison to that, you can see good old permanent pasture, very little runoff, and the water that did infiltrate through the grassland is much freer of sediment. And then if you move over to the left into the sort of more rotational situations, then no-till and the herbal lay actually looking quite good as well. Which brings me on to another quote, and I won't put any more quotes. I'll stop on the quotes now, but I really like this one because, again, I think it's a really good one. Soil is not being lost because we're farming; it's being lost because of how we're farming, and we can do better in that regard. So, looking at direct drilling is not a new concept. It existed quite widely in the 90s, long before my time in agronomy, but I think it's fair to say in the last 10 or certainly the last 5 years, technology on drills and machines and our understanding of soils has really increased. So there are a good range now of no-till or zero-till disc-based machines on the market that move virtually zero soil. And sometimes I go to clients' farms and you actually do struggle to see whether a field has actually been drilled or not. You've then got something that's a bit more of an intermediate, I suppose, in terms of a strip till machine, which is generally time-based. And as the name suggests, is moving a sort of narrow strip of soil. And when we're looking at trying to measure our soil health, obviously organic matter is the one that often takes the press at the moment, and a lot of the SFI options look to be building around organic matter. It remains to be seen, I suppose, as what Harold was saying, is where we end up going in terms of payments linked to soil health or soil carbon. But we can split soil health into three key component areas: the physical, the chemical, and the biological. And within those, we can measure where we are, and then from that draw a baseline and look to improve. And organic matter is something that's really important. If you move away from and look away from the stuff around policy and payments from government, from a pure practical farming point of view, it should be in everyone's interest to look to try to improve organic matter anyway. Because this is a good graph that I've taken from Yara, showing the availability of the key plant nutrients in different organic matter levels. And I circled the 0 to 2 because it's quite common for me to be on an arable farm that's got a long history of cultivations and not much of a history of organic manures. And you can see that within that sort of 0 to 2.5 of organic matter, most of the key plant nutrients aren't particularly available. Whereas if we were able to move across to 6 or 8 even, then we'd have a great deal more available to us. And by doing that, we reduce our reliance on synthetic fertilizers and inputs. So how can we improve organic matter? The fastest way is actually, unsurprisingly perhaps, through applying organic matter. So that's been shown in a lot of long-term work now, that it can be as much as 5 times faster doing that versus something like applying cover crops. But cover crops will help by not putting metal through our soil. So moving to a direct drill or no-till situation, we're not oxidizing organic matter out of our soils. Returning residues is very helpful, and I'll come on to worms in a moment, but that's been demonstrated in trials to be the quickest way to improve worm numbers in your soils, which has lots of other positive benefits as well. There was a long-term trial in a direct drill scenario looking at the effect of compost, and the compost being applied every third year in this particular situation increased worm numbers by more than 3 times. Some work done by the University of Leeds showed that for every 1% of organic matter that we could increase, that increased our water holding capacity by 10%. And I think that's a massive number. If you look, okay, this spring might pan out to be something quite different based on how it started. But if we look at the last 6 or 7 years, at least a smaller period or even a large period of the spring, we've been in quite a serious drought. And that's resulted in poorer crop performance or in reduced forage availability. So I think it's a really, really important aspect that people need to consider in terms of the sustainability of their systems. So looking at worms, this is work over the last 2 years over a course of nearly 70 fields and over 200 soil pits. And basically what we've been doing is looking at the effect of cultivation on worm numbers in our soils. And what I think what's fascinating is that all types of worm, whether it's the juveniles or the epigeic, endogeic or anesic worms, increase as time progresses from the last cultivation event on the soil. And these aren't necessarily, it says cultivational plough, because not all of these fields, it was a plough, it was a shallow cultivation, like something like a Vardestad carrier in some cases. And the really key one I would suggest is the yellow bar, which are the anesic worms. They're the deep burrowing worms that do a lot of the structuring at depth, and they're probably one of the most important groups. And you can see that they largely don't exist in our arable rotational soils until we get to a point of 5+ years without cultivation. If you look at the impact of things like cover crops or bare stubble, you can see on average, both juvenile worms and adult worms levels are much higher if there's a cover crop. So the cover crop as it's growing and then more importantly breaking down is providing that food source for them. And then moving on to cover crops, because they're a big part of a no-till system and linked to SFI payments quite heavily now as well. They are really important and done well. They can be a very useful tool for reducing reliance on synthetic inputs and helping to structure the soils. But equally done incorrectly, they can actually create a negative effect in yield. And this was a really interesting trial on a client's farm in 2019, where we were comparing a range of different cover crops. And you can see that all bar 2 of them actually decreased the yield of the spring barley. They all had the same 160 kilos of N. The reason for that is the fact that when these cover crops break down at the point of drilling, there's no cultivation going on, so we're not mineralizing any nitrogen. The spring barley was direct drilled into this cover crop, and they left the soil with a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that would be optimal. So they left the soil at 20+1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, and at that point mineralization has stopped and we're actually getting a mobilization. So what's really important here is that when we look at our cover crop design, is we design a cover crop to keep the carbon to nitrogen ratio at something lower where there's going to be nitrogen available. If we don't do that, we find ourselves in a situation where we're going to be getting either lower yielding cereal crops, or we're going to be forced to put more nitrogen on to achieve the same yield, which is obviously not what we're trying to achieve. But you can see the two cover crop mixtures at the top, the crimson clover straight and the Phacelia plus crimson clover, with that legume family plant in there, we're able to reduce the carbon to nitrogen ratio and produce a positive impact on yield. This is just quite a good summary of some work done in the UK by Syngenta, NIAB and a few other partners as a summary of all aspects of a regenerative farming arable system compared with a more standard min-till system. And you can see across everything, we saw a really serious improvement. Yes, the crop establishment and yield were both down 3%, but if you look at the grain margin per hectare, it was up nearly 10% and net profit was up nearly 20%. From an environmental point of view, worm numbers were up nearly 50%, which tallies with the work I've been doing myself, and bird sightings were up, greenhouse gas emissions were down. So it shows that it's going in the direction of travel that we really need to be going. If we look at cost implications overall, this is based on some of my own clients that have changed their farming system quite drastically. The numbers might not be as accurate as they were about 18 months ago, because I appreciate fuel prices have changed, but they have come back down again. But I think it illustrates quite nicely the differences are still valid, though, that the cost per hectare of a plough-based system or even a min-till-based system to zero-till is quite a significant difference, as well as obviously the fuel usage. And I have got people that are down at 6 litres a hectare of fuel for their crop establishment now, which is almost hard to believe. For most of those businesses, they say that their fixed costs have more than halved. They've, as Harold's already mentioned, ceased the use of insecticides. Some of them now are getting close to 10 years without an insecticide applied. They've reduced their use of herbicides and synthetic fertilizer use, particularly P&K is on the way down, but also nitrogen. And so there was some really interesting work published by the Nottingham University a few years ago, which showed that growers could reduce their agrochemical inputs by as much as 30% when it got into been in the system long enough for their soils to transition and they had things working in the way they needed to be. And that's quite dramatic. That's me done. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
Not at all, Todd. No, I had to disappear, not for any reason I wasn't listening to you, but the dog was barking and I couldn't shut it up by waving at it.
Okay.
So I had to disappear and sort of round it up. So Todd, I do apologise. That was very rude of me, but
That's
there
fine.
was a good reason. Adrian, Harold, you listen to Todd. Adrian, Todd, you listen to Harold, and Harold and Todd, you listen to Adrian. Comments to each other, perhaps.
Well, can I kick off?
Please.
I'll kick off because there's on one of Todd's last slides there, I think one of the key aspects that he put up there is time and work rates. And I think, farming, there's less and less people involved. One of the key aspects, and something I learned many years ago from a colleague who was much wiser than me, was the difference between a good farmer and a bad farmer is about a week. And I think, if there's aspects there, work rate, hectares per hour, they're a significant change. So by adopting some of the principles that Todd's talking about, if we can then, do things on a more timely fashion, forgetting all the aspects we're talking about here in terms of policy change and things like that, that could be quite significant in terms of actually, the yield aspect. But just thinking about the support changes and sort of tying Harold's aspects regarding the stewardship and the SFI and the cropping aspect from Todd. What I'm seeing quite a lot in what I'm doing is looking at actually how can we, and partly perhaps driven by the increases in energy and fertilizers, but can we adopt some of these practices and how can we make farming more profitable? How can we replace the basic payment scheme? And quite simply, that's reducing by somewhere around about £35 per hectare. So if you look at some of the figures from Harold, the SFI figures, if we can manage, and maybe not on all of the area, but we can look at £45 a hectare on that, well, that replaces 1 year's reduction in BPS. So it holds that cash. So there's factors there. But also I've looked at, on livestock farms, where using the herbal lays, and Todd's sort of shown how that improves soil and water holding and those factors. But actually it's an incredibly nutritious feed that if we're looking at finishing beef cattle, finishing lambs on that, you can do that. And I've got clients who are doing it without buying in feed, without buying in fertilizers, maybe slightly fewer numbers because it's a different management and it does require a change in management technique. But as Todd pointed out, the important thing is profit. And I can see where profit is being improved and actually, working with the countryside stewardship and those factors to make the system fit the way the direction of travel is support, but actually for many people we consider a better way of managing the farm and managing the land and managing the soil.
Harold?
Yes, I could come on to that one. I think, it's sometimes a bit like the juggernaut, isn't it? Or the oil tanker, is that when I started in the mid-80s, in my time as an agronomist, we were still allowed to sell aldrin and dieldrin, which are organochlorine insecticides. And, we wouldn't want to be looking at that, but they were still there. And that was, that change has happened. And the way in which the industry seems to have coalesced around larger and larger units and bigger kit. 30-meter boom sprayers are now a commonplace, whereas crikey, there was a time when the 12-meter one was considered to be big. So that does start to put a lot of pressure on time and timeliness of operations. And I was with one chap the other week. He was looking at using stewardships essentially to take out all the short work, all that really difficult stuff. And with the boom sprayers increasing in size, he viewed that as a very positive. So his productivity and his efficiencies were likely to increase, whilst maybe his total yield might have dropped a little bit, and he was aware of that, but he seemed to think that his profitability would be improved, and because he wasn't being quite so risky with under the trees and those areas which could lodge, etc., etc. He was very bullish about it, and he was very pleased to be able to use and draw in the stewardship type options into those areas, because they were for him as profitable, if not more profitable, than cropping, and his efficiency and his nitrogen use efficiency and all those metrics of how good a farm is were increasing. So I think he was very positive about it.
It's quite interesting that. Sorry, Todd, I'll let you come in a moment. But actually, we didn't go this far, but I had a client who, using GPS, was able to plot how many times 12 meters across the field and put in or planned AB8 to the wildflower margins, and ended up with basically a rectangular field with some funny shape margins around it. But actually, yes, so that there wasn't an overlap. It was X number of passes fitted into the remaining size of the field. And we went through the calculation, and actually sort of it worked on 2 or 3 fields, but it got very silly, so we pulled away from it. But the technology's there to do that. Sorry, Todd, you were going to say.
No, I was going to agree. I think you'll tell me better than I know, Adrian. Is AB8's flowers with grasses? Is AB1 the straight flowers?
That's the one. I'm glad to see you've done your homework, Todd.
Yeah, I thought it was that. So I just wanted to check before I went and said it. But no, I've got some people that are looking at AB1 or putting in AB1. And there's some really interesting, I think it's CEH, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and people like Marek Nowakoski have got some really good data around those. If you the density, I think there's the limitation as how far, but if you can get those types of margins around some of your arable fields, the density increase in predators as well as pollinators is pretty impressive, actually, especially something like parasitic wasps and those type of aphid predators. So it can help assist us moving away, for those people that haven't already, from insecticides. And the other thing I was just going to say, if you link to Adrian's point, is actually, if you're interested, I've got a couple of slides I saw which I saved because I thought they were interesting, which illustrate your point quite nicely, Adrian, about lambs and live weight gains of lambs and beef cattle. So basically what you were saying about herbal lays, the number of species having a significantly beneficial effect. And in this case, it was showing 6, but yeah, the same on both the beef as well as the lamb, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah. I could also show you a graph, if I could actually ever find it again, which was the data that we used when presenting to the EU, why we should have this particular option. And interestingly, bog standard grass, very low insect levels, grass with its legumes, decent amount, grass, legumes and herbs up here. So, we are hitting 2 particular targets with that, when you got the biodiversity one, the pollinator element of it, etc., as alluded to, plus the fact you've got that better performance of lambs and your better stock performance. But it is going to take a while for that to work its way through. We've seen farms, and Adrian will have seen it more than me, potentially, sort of polarizing, isn't it? They just go for one thing, and that's good at one level, but your resilience starts to dip down. And one of the discussions we had when I was at head office was how to make the farming systems more resilient. And essentially, it was to diversify elements of it. And the regen agriculture approach seemed to be very much the one which was giving the best results, and the stability there You weren't going to hit the highs, but you weren't going to hit the lows. So you just want to be boring in the middle. And that seemed to be what, and I think SFI and CS can help you get to that place.
I mean, I was surprised that the Europe doesn't support that, because the longest standing bit of data I've ever seen around the effect of increased species was the GINA project, I think it's called, in Germany, which has been running since 2002. And I'm pretty sure all of their data was almost a straight line graph on the effect of biomass growth as the number of species increased.
We had to, when we were making the changes, because we were introducing new options into an existing scheme, and you could do that if the evidence was there. So when we have these new schemes coming in at parts of the CAP, it was fine. But with this one, the weight of evidence was so strong that we decided we weren't going to wait. So we then went into Europe and said, look, we've got some good evidence and we need to get this option into schemes. And it was in the old countryside stewardship, I think it was it the HLS? Either way, we got it in, and I think it's been a very successful option as far as I can see.
One question that's come, it's a very basic question, is obviously this is a very complicated and involved subject. For members who are feeling a bit overwhelmed, where's the best port of call? Where do they start? Who should they speak to get really into what they should be doing?
Probably somebody like Adrian, I would suggest.
Well, it was a potential plug for Adrian, of course.
Well, and of course, as I mentioned, they can use the Future Farming Resilience Fund, and they can get free advice. And that, to be honest on that, and serious for a moment, that is what it's designed for. It's designed to help farmers through the transition. So that is and yes, I am eligible to deliver that. So there's the plug. But actually, my starting point on this is, what are we trying to achieve? So, okay, what are the objectives we want to get to? And that obviously ties into the farming system and those sort of factors. But then if it is about, from an arable perspective, you would look at the people such as Todd, who is able and demonstrating it. And most probably a very good people are your neighbours. So what else is happening over the other side of the hedge? I mean, Todd and Agrii do the various events. AHDB do various events from whether it's an arable or whatever. It's getting out and seeing what's happening and seeing it for yourself and going and kicking some soil and looking at the impact. I think those are the best things to do, is to just go and do the research. Yes, I can help, and Todd can help, and Harold can help, or Harold and his colleagues can help onto the various different aspects of it. But it's actually, what do you want to do? And there is no one size fits all.
A related sort of question come up. A lot of these options require professional advice or sign-off, in particular sign-off. Are there enough people to do that, and will this hold up the process?
I suppose that one might be coming my way. There are not that many which do require a ecologist to be involved. There's a little, and there are a number of those ones out there already. But I think if you're looking at the way in which you need a basis agronomist potentially, or your vet to do this stuff, well, one of the desires was that this would create and stimulate a new sector, the agri-ecology sector. So you're not just purely agronomists, you're not just ecologists, but you kind of mash where in the middle. And there's quite a lot of people coming into that. And I'm heartened when I see some of the younger folk moving into it. There are other agents companies out there, not just Savills, who are doing this stuff. And there's certainly a number of young, brighter, energetic professionals coming in. And
do you fall in that category, Harold?
I would fall myself in the old wizened old git one with the grey hairs, and having flogged a little bit of IPU in my time and a bit of paraquat. I'm not sure that I've been able to expunge all my sins yet, but it is that thing. It's that there are a lot of people coming in here. Some of them, you won't be able to get it for free, but then you look at the likes of Todd and his colleagues within Agrii and within Hutchinson's and within Crop Advisors and any number of these companies out there. There's a new cohort, and I think that's where the future lies, not with the old gits with the grey hair. Sorry, old gits with grey hair.
I don't take it personally, is the answer,
Okay.
Harold. Yeah.
Nigel, can I just go off on a slightly different Or same
Please do.
basis, but on a different question. And I've been doing a lot of basic payment scheme applications. So sit down with farmers and talk through the cropping, talk through issues, talk through the sustainable farming incentive. And one of the ones that comes up then is the no insecticides, 45, and actually the sort of non-inversion at £55 a hectare options. And one of the comments I often get asked in that is, yes, but what about glyphosate? And those sort of factors. Does regenerative work without glyphosate? So, Todd, I'm not an agronomist. So how do you answer that question?
That is a good one and probably a fair challenge to the system. So if you went over to the States where there are certain farms and certain advisory groups that are trying to make regenerative farming work without glyphosate for the obvious reasons of the name glyphosate has in the States, they are using things like boronic acid as a substitute. It's not probably something I'd be that keen to be pouring into a sprayer. It'd probably have labels on it saying stay 10 miles away from it if you're pregnant, and go into a full decontamination suite before you eat your lunch, I suspect. So it's not something I'd want to be using, and I don't think its LD50 would actually be as safe as glyphosate is. So I'm not so sure that's the way it needs to go. There's a lot of work happening behind the scenes, so I'm told, around things like superheated foam. I'm not quite sure how that will work in the real world with sprayers, but dissolving the waxy cuticle of plant leaves and then leaving them exposed to the elements. You've probably heard and seen, and it's actually happening. I actually saw someone doing it the other day, actually, weeds being burnt by councils, or weeds having basically vinegar, acetic acid applied to them. But again, it's a bit of a strange rabbit hole to have gone down, because acetic vinegar has a worse LD50, a lower LD50 than glyphosate does. So I'm not quite sure that's the solution either. And I'm not sure our soil biology would appreciate a dose of vinegar once a year or twice a year either. So unfortunately, I don't think there is a non-glyphosate solution at the moment. I think what's more likely to happen is that the sprayer technology, the eyes on sprayer to be able to see green and switch nozzles on and off, I don't think is very far away now. We will be able to go across in the initial trials of that. I'm told 70 to 90% reductions in glyphosate usage where that technology is being implemented. So I think we're still reliant on glyphosate, I'm afraid, at the moment, but we probably, in the fullness of time, will need to use less. I think what's probably going to happen with glyphosate, if I was a betting man, is the pre-harvest label at some point will disappear. I think CRD have taken a much more pragmatic and practical view on it than some of our European neighbours have, and I think hopefully we'll keep stubble usage.
Yeah, we haven't.
Sorry, I'll just say, to answer my own question a little bit on that, I have seen a lot of inter-row hose with GPS and that sort of thing as a way of weed control. Sorry, Harold.
I think the sort of aspiration at a European level, and certainly even at an England level, is to use less pesticides. The Europeans were writing in a 50% reduction, weren't they? But we never wrote that in the UK. Ours was a pesticide action plan, which has yet to be signed off. The aspiration is to use less kit, less stuff, either through technology or through IPM, etc., etc. I wouldn't say that, if Europe banned or took a different stance to it, then we would have the issues of being able to sell our products into that market. And one of the questions really for you, Adrian, would be, how do you think the market and the end users are going to be driving this particular question, rather than it being a purely technological question? It's what the consumer wants, and perception, as we well know, when you're a consumer, is all that matters, or is very, very important. Do you see contracts being awarded for zero glyphosate use?
Yes, I do. I can see that. I'm just smirking on that, because don't get me started on actually the perception of what the consumer wants, because the consumer doesn't necessarily know. The consumer gets told what it wants by big industry. But nonetheless, yes, I can see that increasing, coming through. Yeah.
But if you were to do, I think, this is where life cycle assessment comes in. If you were to do an energy picture of a farm with using a couple of litres of glyphosate a year, that's compared to some of the other scenarios, then you might be a little bit surprised at how little energy is involved in a couple of litres of glyphosate.
Yeah,
And
it's
also,
little
I think-
energy and workload and all those
Yeah.
sort of factors that we talked about at the start of this.
And also carbon. I'd be surprised if it caused us a problem in Europe, because let's not forget what Europe still imports in big quantities. I mean, GM soya is still a massive import. They still bring in canola from Canada. I'd struggle to see how, if we go down a slightly different route than they do, why that's going to mean they wouldn't import our produce. I don't see that.
Can I sort of take us back to where we started? Because actually, unbelievably, we're not too far away from our allotted time. Because obviously we're talking, this primarily is about changes in agricultural support. Are there anything else you want to talk about? We were discussing before, Adrian, is it only ELMS, or are there the other areas of support? Anything else you want to say?
No, I think it's just, it is increasingly that ranges of support coming through. And for me, I'm trying to work in this field, and it's hard to keep up with which level of grant and what is available. So it's somehow just for people to keep an eye on that, whoever they've got as their professionals to help them, to keep an eye on that, because increasingly most things there is a grant somewhere. If it's looking at a new piece of machinery, a new system, something like that, there is a grant. And also there is the England Rural Prosperity Fund coming out with Dorset. I think there's about £2 million worth of funding over a 2-year period. We have no idea the detail of that, but those sort of factors will become available as well. So it's just a case of trying to keep an open mind to it and just keep aware of what is happening.
And for our peasant, the point that we were raising earlier again, for our peasant farmer, small man with a few acres, is there anything to help him?
Yes, there is. Yeah, and things like the SFI. Actually, there's £1,000 just for doing the application, which, well, up to, if it's up to 50 hectares. So that's there, and they're just as eligible for the countryside stewardship options and management options, and also things like woodland creation, and potentially carbon, and there'll be factors coming into that. So yes.
The question I get asked often, Adrian, which I was going to raise before, because there must be other people thinking the same, so I've been asked it a number of times, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer it, is what crossover is going to be permitted between the new ELMS scheme and SFIs?
I think that's one for Howard, actually.
Well, it is one for me, and I'll put that into the unknown unknowns.
Right, there isn't an answer.
There is something, and I was reading it because a colleague highlighted it, about the crossover between biodiversity net gain type of and stewardships. There is something out there in the public domain about that, and that might be a better one to look at. But yes, there's a lot of uncertainty with existing schemes. How are we going to integrate existing areas into the new SFI soil standards and things of that ilk? I am told that DEFRA are working on it, and I raised it when I was in head office. We want some certainty, because I think with that certainty you'll get better uptake. One of the reasons why uptake is relatively low is that it didn't seem to fit particularly well with the offer that we're going to get this autumn, which will be the 23 offer, the 6 standards coming in, hedgerows, and on top of the existing soil and animal welfare ones, we'll have, I think, 9 standards, and then there are even more standards coming through. So it's not going to get any easier. And some of us might remember the good old days of ELS and HLS, and we pined for that simplicity. But I'm sorry to say, I don't think that's going to be the case.
One of our questioners has just said to me, we've heard that £36 million is coming out of West Dorset as a result of the changes. Comments, please.
That figure, I think, is based on land area times £90 per acre BPS, and then what's available different. I think that's where, because I've done sort of similar calculations on that. But actually, the funding is there to be got at. It's just harder to get. So there is scope to go and get it and get the share of it. But as Harold said, there are costs involved on some of that, so it's not a complete like-for-like swap.
Okay. Well, it is, I think, 7:30. on the dot. I do try and make sure that we actually do keep to time, not so much for us, the panelists, but for everybody who's watching, so they can disappear now and have their second gin and tonic or glass of wine or whatever they're going to go into at 7:30. So it just leaves me to thank you all hugely. Adrian, Harold, Todd, fantastic. Thank you for the effort that you put in preparing for this. And on behalf of the Society, it's really, really kind of you to give up your time to help us out. So thank you on behalf of the Society, and to our attendees, obviously, thank you. And hopefully some of the comments and information being provided was of help to everybody. And I look forward to receiving perhaps some thoughts of the next webinar, because we will do one as soon as we come up with the right question to answer. Anyway, thank you all again, and we'll see you at some time in the future. Thank you.
Cheers, everybody. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye then.